Today, I want to just talk briefly about two items, and mostly because they're one of them's pretty big in the community. Well, they both are actually, and so that's really why they're both on the agenda for today. So there's a difference. Well, let me back up, and I'll start with this because you're probably seeing this more and more now if you've been around, and if you haven't been around, you're seeing it and not maybe not knowing what to make of it and so forth. Um, I'll start out by saying that there was a time, pretty much the entirety of the last 3 years, from Genesis to 3 years out, where talking about Saya was essentially, a non-thing here with us. We started out moving away from that project, wanting to be a supportive and friendly fork that essentially helped solve a problem that they made, that they knew they were making, that they made willingly, that was going to be a very devastatingly financially destructive problem for a lot of people in their community. Um, and so our fork was essentially built to help mitigate that. And ultimately, then we found our own feet and our own ideas. But it became really quickly understood that even though they said that they were going to support us, that they really weren't, and they didn't. And not only did they not support us, but it became really clear that they weren't going to even tolerate us, that they were going to go out of their way, and they weren't even going to do it overtly. I mean, if they had just stood up and said, this is bullshit. We put all this time into coding. We don't want anybody else to use it. We're going to go after you. Then that would have been to me been more of a honest sort of scenario, because we then at least could have went, at it. But that's not what they did. They went under the table and did all that stuff. So we just didn't talk about it much. And the deal is that underneath our project is a blockchain that they themselves essentially forked. They forked Bitcoin in many respects to build the blockchain. They did change a few things in terms of, the difficulty algorithm adjustment or difficulty adjustment algorithm that takes place on there that changes difficulty in the mining. They changed a few things in terms of how the emission schedule changes. So one of the interesting features of Bitcoin, you could argue probably it's become a bit of a negative. I don't know. But this whole idea of this 4-year halving is really kind of a challenge, because it really sort of forces the Bitcoin ecosystem into a specific monetary scenario, right? So now you have these big giant valleys in between the halvings, and then you have these big parabolic runs. One could say that's actually a feature, not a bug, but at the end of the day, it is driven by the fact that that emission is halved every 4 years, which is just entirely too long in many cases at this point. When it gets down there to where the emission, halving is only going to be a few coins, it'll be really interesting, because we don't know what it'll be valued at that point. If it's valued really high, then it'll be the exact same situation. If it stays at the current value, it's going to be weird. So in the case of our blockchain, what happens is every block that's minted on a 10-minute average clock loses 0.01 SCP on a declining schedule. And what the impact of that is, as you start to head towards zero, is that you get this declining emission that started out really big, and then ultimately by the time it's towards the very end, it becomes almost flat. And then that's why we say there's a ceiling of 55 million, because essentially once we get to 55 million, it's going to take 100 years to get to 58 million. So it does decline. The inflation does decline significantly as you get out there. And we're already 85% of the way through the mining emission. That's the other thing that I think a lot of people that are new to the project don't really understand. This question that comes up a lot is, when is mainnet? Well, mainnet started on October 31st, 2018, and the blockchain has been being mined consistently since then. And people have sacked away huge, huge, huge bags of coins, in that process, bags that you can't even dream of today. You just couldn't get to them. So that's sort of the big fundamental underneath of the original fork. And when we forked, we didn't actually fork. We didn't take the blockchain at block 179, for instance, and carry that over. What we did is we started over at Genesis and created our own schedule and started from scratch. So that was the first thing that we rewrote. The second thing that we rewrote was the secondary token on there, which is the SPFs. On their blockchain, they have 10,000 of these things, and they have a certain value applied to them. And in our blockchain, we have 200 million of them. Ours are built to distribute to the community. Theirs were built for their founders to essentially make money off their blockchain forever. And, whether one is better than the other, I don't know. But in our case, we want the community to own the network in a lot of ways and to own a share of taking, rewards off the network. So making 200 million of them sets them up to do really well when we go out to do a public crowd sale when people just want to buy small chunks. So that's the deal there. And then the thing that really I want to talk about is this contract. And the second, it's not really a second layer, but this overlayer, this stateful state contract layer, whatever you want to call it. It's got a number, payment channel layer. It's got a number of different ways of describing it. But essentially what it is, it's a scripting layer that runs on top of the blockchain and forms what are colloquially known as smart contracts. And they're not really smart. I think a lot of people sort of understand that the smartness in terms of our contract is that they just don't need a lot of intermediation in terms of bankers, lawyers, and other accountants and other kinds of professionals. So what happens is the contracts are auto formed with you, the providers, and there are revisions that take place throughout the contracts but only things that ever get printed to the blockchain are the contract formation, the final revision, and then ultimately a storage proof. And so in the middle of all that, there's money movement, because what happens is that, you and I shake hands and say we're going to put 100 SCP into a contract. And, what happens is I put up 100 SCP in order to rent storage from you. And then you put up 100 SCP as collateral, saying, okay, I'm willing to back my play up to 100 coins, not a problem. Put all your storage on here. And then what happens is that at the end of the contract, if I used your entire thing, if there's a way for me to do that, then the 100 coins would transfer to you, and you would get your 100 SCP collateral back. But that's not how the money moves. The way the money moves is the coins are put up into an address, an output, and essentially as the contract progresses and as changes occur, like for instance, I start off and I rent a terabyte from you, but then decide, okay, now I need another terabyte. That's a change. It doesn't result in a transaction that gets printed to the blockchain at that point, but it does result in money moving from one output to another. And so if you were watching wallets, you'd actually see coins move. And it's really confusing to people because, they're like, where's the transaction for this? I saw money move and my wallet's lower and there's no transaction. There's nothing to back it up. Somebody's stealing money from me. And, that's not what's going on. And same time, the good developers over on the other project didn't see it really all that important to solve the accounting issue there. And we haven't found a way yet to see that made more transparent. So this is a big to-do item for us in terms of getting that accounting done. It's literally something that's critical. If we don't have a real easy way for you to just look at your balance on a given period of time. I mean, that does work, by the way. You can just say, well, I had X amount of coins on January 1st, then I had X amount of coins on January 31st. But having a more granular accounting of how the money was earned against your storage is going to be a lot better, environment for you when it comes time to start declaring this as a business and putting it on your taxes and all of that sort of stuff. And it will be better for us to give you CSV type file or something along those lines. So that is a big thing that's still out there to be done. And that's that second layer contract is by and large the same scripted layer, payment channel layer as it is on the other project. And we borrowed that. Now, what we're doing on top of that, the key part is that it's the second layer renter application that we're writing that has all of our IP behind it and all of our energy and our direction, because that is the application that is going to allow individual customers to onboard and then ultimately use your storage. And that's a piece that they were efforting for years. They worked on it for years, and they ultimately abandoned it after like 5 years of solid hard work, which was really surprising to me. I mean, it just kind of blew me out of the water. And when I say abandoned, what I should say is that the main founder, the founder whose voice really matters over there, decided that it was no longer, something to continue forward on. And he went off and came up with a whole new idea, and they're efforting the whole new idea. Whereas the other founder is still in charge of a development effort on the original renter, but whether it actually gets updated or carried forward, it's hard to really know or say. And if you look at their roadmaps and things like that, it isn't the priority for them. So it exists, but mainly they are focused on that second layer thing that's different now. That's not the same thing we're doing. So this thing we're doing, this relayer application on top, has an interesting feature. So, it's different from, say, for instance, Firebase, and it's different from, say, for instance, storage, in that with Firebase is a company that is building a centralized application, totally centralized application on top of decentralized networks. And the situation there is they work with storage and Sai, and I think they also say they work with Filecoin. I don't know how that works, but the situation there is that they essentially just act as a renter into these networks, and then the contracting that happens between them and the individual network that's going on. In our case, when we first started out with our white paper and our whiteboarding that we were going to build this thing, we sort of sat down and said, well, we need to make these things called a relayer. And I mentioned this last week. I was pretty, enthusiastic about this, that, you can go back and there's some documents out there from 2018 and 2019 that we wrote where we actually described the relayer, that this isn't something that we just sort of thunk up. It was something we put a lot of time and energy into. And it's still very much what our original vision was. But the deal is that, the original thought process was every relayer would be a distributed renter out there, and every relayer would be contracting with the network. And in that world, every relayer would end up, acquiring SCP coins, building contracts with whatever section or segment of the network it needed to work on, uploading data to it, and then ultimately getting storage proofs back and paying out the money against the storage that they put up on the network. Well, there's some problems with that, and we realized them almost immediately. In that, well, one of the things is if you do that, right, if you put this relayer out there and you say, it's got its own contracts and so forth, well, what's to stop the customer from saying, well, why am I paying you dollars then? Why don't I just go ahead and cut you out of the loop here, and I'll just put money into the contract myself, and then that way it's a completely and totally decentralized network. Yay, we win. And, SCP Corp can just go away. That's actually the future, by the way. That is the future. But it isn't the immediate future. The immediate future is that most of these customers aren't going to want to mess with coins. They aren't going to want to have that level of liability and responsibility against the network. And they're going to end up working against contracts that we form. So we have the responsibility of buying the SCPs and putting them into the contracts. So there is a centralization component there. But the relayer itself lives at the customer. And so the customer has the relayer on premise in the cloud, somehow under their control. And then when their data is uploaded from engineering or HR or wherever into the relayer cache, where it gets encrypted and sharded and ultimately then sent up to the network, they still have control of their data. It's all in their hands. It never enters our control. We never have access to their data. If the cops come and say to us, you need to give us file xxx.jpg, we're just going to say, yeah, I mean, you're going to have to go see those guys about that because we don't have that. We don't have access to it. We don't, have any ability to touch that data. And so that's the beginning of the move towards a truly decentralized global network. And we've always shorthanded that as evolution, then revolution, because it doesn't cause them to revolutionize some of the real serious parts of things, like, how they pay for cloud storage. If there's a comptroller and an accounting team that are, currently spending $50,000-$60,000 a month on storage in the cloud, one of the things that you really don't want to force on them is this ability to go out to have to buy a bunch of Bitcoin and hold it, because they might buy Bitcoin in January and, budget for, however many terabytes. And then all of a sudden, by the time it gets to be March and they've converted some of it or all of it into SCP, then the value is now half of what it once was. And now all of a sudden they no longer have what they need budgeted into it. So the only way they could effectively do it is to, buy only when they need it for the contracts, but then they have to have some mechanism there to keep an eagle eye on that, which originally our thought process is we would write it into the thing, a script to have it automatically go out and buy on the exchange and dump into the thing. And in the future, that will end up being, one of those directions that we potentially head down. But for now, what ends up happening is the customer doesn't have to care. They just pay us with a credit card, and then we handle that on the back end in terms of acquiring the coins and putting them into that contract. So the reason we're having this conversation today is because contracting is becoming, something that people are starting to consider and think about. And one of the first things any provider does once they get their instance stood up is to say, when do I start getting contracts? And then they get into this sort of mindset. They're like, I only got 2 contracts. What's up with that? Aren't I supposed to, be getting, contracts left and right? I know I'm not going to get a bunch of data right away, but shouldn't I be getting, 10, 20, 30 contracts? And, thinking that the number of contracts have some, proportionality to the number of data gigabytes or terabytes that ultimately they're going to end up with on their units. And that's not how it's working in our architecture. The way it works in our architecture, so let me back up again and talk about the first project. So in the first project, every single customer has a quote unquote renter in their, purview. And so if I'm an IT admin, I stand up this renter, right, and go ahead and upload data onto the network. And that renter forms contracts with the network, and then ultimately it stores all of the meta files as individual files. So I'll just give an example. In my own case, I have a pretty large music collection. And so on some renters that I ran for a lot of years, I had literally hundreds of thousands of these metadata files. And it was one of the things that caused me to recognize that we needed to do that differently. And we needed to aggregate all that metadata into a database architecture, which is one of the key pieces of IP that we did develop in terms of developing this relayer concept. The second thing that happens over there is that one renter applies to one computer, really, not even one person. It's one computer, because those meta files live on that computer, and wherever those meta files live, That's literally the situation. So all of a sudden in a business, you can start to understand that that's literally untenable. It can't work. Nobody can access the data other than the person who's using the user that's using that individual computer. So what was needed was what was colloquially termed back in 2017 a distributed renter, right? Something that actually allowed multiple seats to access the same storage pools and at the same time access and create the same storage metadata and do the contracting and so forth around that. So in our case, that piece is called the relayer, and it works. I mean, this was I was so proud of us when this thing finally worked for the first time. And now the way it works today is just insane. It's something that we're going to look back on in hindsight and say this was a pretty monumental achievement for us. And the deal is that, we're now in the process over the last, 12, 14 months of making it more efficient, making it more robust, making it more everything, that you need to have to run in a real production environment. And so in this case, we do end up splitting up the metadata from where the contracts are generated, right? The metadata actually lives on these individual relayer instances in a Postgres database. And ultimately, everybody in their organization that has permissions can access those meta files. And ultimately, that means they can access the data on their network and that's uploaded to our network. But the contracts actually are formed on our end, and then they actually, talk to our server, to use additional resources, to buy more storage, to do contract revisions and all of that sort of stuff. And then at the very tail end, when it comes time to do a contract proof, it goes through our server out to the storage providers, and then ultimately a successful proof transfers and does a final positive transaction on the blockchain, and unsuccessful storage proof essentially says no soup for you and all the coins are burned. They aren't returned back to anybody. So that's an interesting feature, by the way. So it brings up some pretty interesting stuff that I think people are probably finally starting to get to and understanding exist as a thing on our network. So first of all, with that centralized contracting, we are kind of a point of failure, a single locus of failure. So that's a pretty important understanding to have. It's also a centralization component. So, when you come here and you're, a crypto rebel and you're all about anarchy and disintermediating all the governments, that's kind of like one of those no buzzwords. And the minute there's any centralization, oh my God, the project's wrecked. And, that's not really how it's going to work, by the way. What's going to end up happening is we're going to sort of, sideways walk into Web3. And on the way there, a bunch of companies, just like in 2001, are going to come out of this, earthquake of development and, begin to find their feet and move forward. That's how Amazon came alive. That's how, Google came alive. That's how all those big, what people are calling Web 2 companies came alive. And there will be a similar situation coming out of this Web 3 thing. Now, some people in crypto believe that the whole world's just going to move to this anarchical sort of environment where everybody does everything self-service. And yeah, it's an interesting dream. Some things might find their way there quicker than others. In my belief, what's going to end up happening is people are going to still want to continue to operate under old paradigms as customers. And crypto has such a bad reputation amongst normies anyway that it becomes a real losing battle to go out into the real world and trying to sell to them. And there just isn't that many crypto people to sell only to them. And there's just so many reasons why, this strategy to sort of divorce the crypto and sort of not really focus on it in terms of the product and sales conversations makes a ton of sense. And in that world, this idea of centralization isn't really that big of a, thing. It's more of a thing of, oh, okay, but is it, safe? Does it introduce vectors that are challenging to the project? Does it cause some other wrinkles that we should be aware of? And that is definitely the questions that need to be answered. And so, for instance, one of the very first ones, we've talked about this ad nauseum in December, when 11,000 people showed up to the project out of the blue, it did buckle a lot of our infrastructure. And one of those pieces of infrastructure that buckled a little bit was this contracting server. And the deal there is that if that contracting server goes down on our end, the whole thing is done. It's all done. So on our end, what we've done since then is we've gone back to the drawing board a little bit, and we've worked on some streaming capacities into that server itself. So we've added Kafka as a major component. We're probably one of the few projects that legitimately can use Kafka all the way. And so we've added that to it. But to make Kafka robust, what you really need to do is to build a clustered environment. So we're in the process right now of building that out, so that ultimately, we can eliminate, a point of failure there. And then ultimately, we will continue to drive different kinds of ways of, backing up that data and making it more robust, and probably putting Cloudflare on the front end of it in order to mitigate against things like DDoS and other kinds of, potential vectors that are coming down the pike at us. We feel like we have that pretty well covered on our end. I also have been thinking pretty clearly that you don't have it covered on your end, right? That we haven't done as much as we need to do yet to make sure you have it covered on your end. Because think about it. If you just extrapolated what I said, what we ultimately are going to start with is this process where we build a contract with every provider on the network. So you as providers essentially have one contract. If you have more than one contract, you have too many contracts, right? If you have more than one, that means you have a contract with a guy up the street who's uploading kid porn, right? Or the Game of Thrones, maven who's essentially serving up his torrents now on our network. That's what that means, right? Or something to that effect. It's not really actually true today. You might have 3 or 4 contracts with us because we have a bunch of testing instances of our contractor server, and we're running different versions of our relayer that actually use different contracts and contractors. So today, when you start out and you have like 2 or 3 contracts, that is actually us. But in the future, the idea will be you'll have one contract, one production contract. Well, now I started thinking about that, and I said, well, in the first year or so, it's probably not going to be that big of a deal. But imagine we get to a place where it's 3 years out and you've got 200 terabytes worth of capacity on the network, and 100 terabytes gets filled up across maybe 150 relayers accessing your instance. You've just become a really, really, really lucrative target, right? Somebody would look at that and say, well, geez, that storage proof that's coming up here is pretty valuable to that person. I mean, look, I'm doing the math on the blockchain. It looks to me like that storage proof is going to be worth about $9,200. If I went ahead and, built a script across the entire network, I could probably DDoS all of the, providers right at the time that they were about to present a storage proof, and essentially hold them offline long enough that I could get ransom out of them so I could free up their storage proofs, and bam, next thing you know, I'm living in Belize with, my millions of dollars. So that's a thing. That is definitely a thing. And so one of the solutions that we've looked at to add in there, and it doesn't, like I said, it doesn't have to happen immediately, but it does have to happen, right? So it will be something that will sprint out over the coming year. By the way, this is the kind of stuff that your license fees pay for. And so what happens there is that we already have in our contractor server the ability to put a governor or a limitation on the amount of terabytes that are stored on any given contract. Today, what happens if you hit that limitation, and it's a high ceiling, so none of you are going to hit it, anytime soon. But if you did hit it today, what would happen is your provider would go off into a limbo where it would no longer be getting any additional data. It would just hit the ceiling and stop. You'd still continue to work against the data you already have and present a storage proof for renewals, but at the end of the day, you wouldn't get any more. So we already got half the coding done to get to the next step. And the next step would be something along the lines of, okay, you hit the ceiling, and then the next thing is it forms a second contract on a different renewal schedule. So you start off with today's contract and the renewal is slated for April 8th. Well, then another contract is formed and the renewal is scheduled for April 15th or April 20th or something like that. And by staggering them out, you get into a place where all of a sudden you've made it much harder for an attacker to be able to do anything in a concerted and malicious kind of way. Not saying they can't. This is a feature of this kind of network. I mean, if an attacker got really serious at attacking you specifically, they could bring a bunch of resources to bear and just DDoS your entire network into the ground, right? And make it so that you could never present a storage proof. But there are even ways around that. And this whole idea of switching from dynamic DNS to regular IP addresses, for instance, is one, because if you keep hopscotching IP addresses, you keep forcing the attacker to change their vector and to come back at you. So they have to be really, really serious about you in particular, and they're not usually on these botnets. So we think that's ultimately going to be providing a pretty adequate layer of protection. But the idea being is that we'd form a secondary, tertiary, fourth, fifth, sixth contract with you, depending on once you hit certain kinds of amounts of data. That means that any individual contract that you carry only has a certain amount of risk attached to it. If you lost due to corruption or whatever that one contract, it might not, take down more than, say, 10% or 20% or some percentage of the storage that you have on your system. So it's a really important idea. And at the same time, we also have looked at other potential ways of doing it in terms of, changing the length of storage proof. So right now, I think the default on storage proofing Windows is 24 hours, might be 48, but I think it's 1 to 2 days. And, we could do something where essentially, like, let's say, you have 2 terabytes stored, then your window is like 36 hours. If you have 4 terabytes stored, maybe your window then goes out to being something like 72 hours. And the window elongates for you to provide a storage proof dependent upon how valuable the payload is that's on your rig. And it's one other potential way we might solve the problem, or we might work multiple of these solutions together into a single sort of, sprint update that we do to the client down the road. But that's a thing. And in concert with that thing is this other notion. So, there are some times where contracts do get corrupted. And if you've ever seen this, you're running these contracts, and then all of a sudden your instance won't start because it gets a panic. And, you look through it and you say, okay, well, it looks like it doesn't like this one contract. And you go and you pull that contract out. And next thing you know, SPD starts up fine and you're good to go because that contract got corrupted. I don't know, maybe Windows monopolized your drive overnight and that contract was trying to be written to while it happened or something like that. That's a potential thing. But if you only have one contract and that one contract gets corrupted, well, that's going to be a bad thing, right? And you're not going to be happy about it. And you're really not going to be happy when there's a lot of money on the line. So it's another area that we're looking at. And the idea there is that we definitely think that you should have, some sort of metadata backup capability on your systems, whether it's snapshotting, whether it's, having, mirroring. Mirroring introduces some other issues. If it's a corrupted contract, you end up mirroring the corruption. But at least with mirroring, if the drive fails, you still have the contract in place. So it does mitigate at least some of the potential, things that can happen to a contract. So you definitely need something in there. You don't have the ability right now to protect yourselves 100%, but you do have the ability to protect some significant portion of it. we're really going to recommend at some point that if you have multiple drives, that you just spread, you know, the metadata out in terms of some kind of a mirrored or you know, RAID capability onto your multiple drives. But the multiple drives themselves actually have a interesting feature that factors into this conversation. So what ends up happening right now, and the way that the software was originally written, and I don't really know what they were thinking here, because this one seems really easy, and I don't. It doesn't fit their MO. You know, you'll hear me say a lot of bad things about the founder of the other project. You know, the guy literally has no integrity at all. But he's not a bad coder, and he's a pretty smart crypto dude, and he's a pretty good you know, guy in this world of distributed systems. And so this idea that they wrote the original renter so that what it does is, you know, when it stores and uploads data onto these instances, that you get the data and then, you know, aggregate it out into these multiple drive instances equally. It's essentially creating a RAID environment, but it's sort of like a reverse RAID. It's like a Stripe or something like that more than anything. It's not really RAID. It's more of a Stripe, but you don't even buy any performance, right? there's no reason for it, right? And so what ends up happening is you get into the situation where, you know, I upload a terabyte of data to your provider instance. So now what ends up happening is you got 4 drives, and there are a few systems out there in our network that have 4 drives. What ends up happening is it splits that terabyte into 250 gigabyte, you know, segments, and uploads them to the 4 drives equally. And so what ends up happening is you lose one drive, and drive failures are a thing, right? So you lose one drive. Well, now you can't provide a legitimate storage proof. And if you can't provide a legitimate storage proof, your whole contract goes down. So that is a serious weakness. And it's probably near the top of our priority bid. So right now, the priority obviously is to get this product launched. We got to get the product out the door. The next sprints that come down the road, there are 2 or 3 that we've already identified that are very much top of the heap. This is also top of the heap. We've got to change this behavior. And so one of the things that we've decided we're probably going to do in this process is, when we split this information up, that what we ought to do is form multiple contracts with you, right? So tying it in with that, once you hit a certain, you know, limitation, a ceiling, and we'll have to figure out what the right number or answer is there. It might be once you hit, you know, a certain percentage of a drive on your system, for instance, then it's time to go ahead and form a new contract and start storing data on the next drive. And there might even be a, you know, we do rows across 4 drives, then we do more rows, and then we do, you know, until we ultimately end up with a large, not large, but a multitude of contracting on that system, as well as different, you know, data in per contract basis going to each individual drive. The idea being that we split that data up. You know, let's just take the base case of 4 contracts, 4 drives. We split that data up, and at the very least, or most, if you lose one drive, you lose the contract and the, you know, value, the financial value that goes behind that. You know, so that's a really important thing. Once you lose the data, right? Once the data crashes, it can't be recovered. If you have the metadata, it doesn't matter. Once you lose the data, it's not coming back. So you don't want to lose the data on one drive and then lose it across the entire instance. So that's an important sort of concept. And then the second part of it is we can also stagger out the renewals that way. So the renewals happen on one drive today, and then another renewal happens 3 days from now, and so that your renewals are not, you know, being centralized together and aggregated in such a way that, you know, increases your risk profile. So that's another area that we're, you know, will be focused on in terms of building that thing out. So these are the things that we're thinking about in terms of contracting right now. I will touch on this next thing just briefly and then start turning it over to you guys for questions. Well, I'll talk a little about our launch too, but the situation, Well, actually, I just lost my own train of thought there. Well, okay, then I think I'm going to go ahead and move on to launch. I had another thing that I wanted to tell you about the contracts, but for whatever reason, probably because I'm just an old person who really doesn't have a good memory much anymore, I'll have to just remember it later and come back to it. Let's talk a little bit about product launch and what's going to happen there. So everybody knows that we've got this, trade show event coming up. Some of you have purchased or picked up free tickets to the party that's going to be there for the community. I think it's going to be a great time. But I want to talk a little bit about what it is we're actually demonstrating and why and what we expect to come out of it, because we do have certain expectations from it. So first of all, I hate to say this because it's going to sound weird to you and maybe even bad. I don't know. But we didn't even really know what the product was until very recently. Yeah, we knew that we had this relayer and we knew that we had the ability to sell, a focus on archival storage to business customers, SMB, SME type customers right out of the gate. But what exactly were we going to hand them? What were we going to give them? And up until about 2 months ago, we were going to give them a Docker Compose and tell them go ahead and spin this sucker up and just start uploading data. And you go to this website and you pay us for it, and it's all good, and it all works. And it did. And legitimately, that could have been an entire product, I guess, if you really wanted to call it that. But when you start having to demo something to somebody, it really kind of clarifies the mind that the product may not be really a product yet, in terms of how people, are ready to sort of view a product. So we've gone back a little bit to sort of polish it up and to pull it all together under, an umbrella and so forth. And so we have this thing we call a console. And the console is sort of like when you sign up for AWS or you sign up for Oracle, or you sign up for any of these, big clouds, what happens is once you get your sign up, you go into a section where you have all this capability. And most of that capability lives above the S3 storage layer. So right out of the gate, our thing's going to be a lot more simplistic in the early days because, everything that we're doing right now is focused on storage and S3 compatible applications that access and use that storage. Doesn't mean like people that write apps can't use our storage. They definitely can. What it does mean, though, is they can't spin up an EC2 compatible type instance on our network at this point and, use, compute or block for, database storage or, other things like that. So there are ways to use databases, for instance, on our network through S3, but they're not going to be as performant as using a block-based network directly. So there's going to need to be a console there that allows you to do certain things. But again, it's pretty simplistic right now. We know we have a whole IAM to build. Right now we have Keycloak and some pretty solid, but still pretty rudimentary account-based stuff on the back end. There is permissioning. There's, some abilities to do things there. But going forward, if you've worked with any of the big clouds, we're going to have a whole bunch of stuff that you're able to do back there in terms of permissioning different groups in your enterprise to be able to access different buckets, to be able to access different objects on the network and so forth. We're going to be able to, do all the things that you currently do on most of the S3 compatible networks, like, applying different tags for metadata and applying tags for things like life cycling and versioning and, all of the stuff that you typically do on a cloud network. So some of that stuff isn't going to be in version 1. Some of that stuff will come along over the course of this year. But out of the gate, we're going to be able to show a pretty decent console on how you actually first log in and use the system, how you instance a relayer on premise, how you actually purchase storage in a subscription basis, and then, ongoingly go in and continue to have it, deduct or, hit you up for more money every 30 days or whatever it ends up being. So we'll show that. The next thing we're going to show is this application we've written called the Relayer application, which is essentially a graphical front end on a Windows side. If you're somebody that's doing like archival backups on VM or Commvault or Rubrik or whatever, that application is pretty cool looking and has a design and feel to it.
and allows you to spin it up on Windows. If it's Linux world, it does a slightly different instantiation because the people that typically would be more familiar with Linux are going to want something a little bit different than what a lot of times the Windows people are going to want. So might be more of a command line versus a UI. The deal though is that the console and the relayer application had different sort of UXs and UIs, and so the look and feel of them were a little different, and the color schemas and all of that sort of stuff. So we've gone back and we've consistentized those. And then on top of that, we came to this understanding, and it's all really sort of starting to shape up now, in that we have this community network called SC Prime, right? And we also have this corporation called SCP Corp, us, and our product is called ExaNet Services, okay? And that whole Exa logoing or schema also rolls out to a device and licensing system that we built to handle our data storage. So we have this thing called an ExaMiner, which is initially a hardware-based platform, but also now about to roll out and become a software-based platform as well, and licensing component. And so essentially what you have is you have SCP Corp operating this whole ExaNet, which is a network running on sort of a second layer of a decentralized network called the SC Prime network. There's literally nothing stopping you from accepting community-based rent from everybody. You can go out there, and if you can find people to store that stuff on your computer, you can actually earn SCP that way. But we've made it very clear that anybody who accepts outside contracts other than the EXA contracts will not get EXA contracts. And that's the indemnification part of this equation, where we essentially are going to be able to wrap you under the cloak of legality if you adhere to only accepting our customer data that we have control over the contracts, right? We can't go in and grab their data. We can't do anything with their data. But what we can do is we can terminate their contract. And if they don't have a contract, they no longer can access the network in such a way to continue uploading and serving illegal content. And that content will have to come to us from law enforcement or, some, respected official entity out there that has the power to bring, deleterious behavior to the network, harm, shutting it down, whatever. So that's kind of the situation that exists there. And so that ExaMiner software licensing strategy and so forth falls under the same tent. So it's renter and host. Renter is the relayer, host is the ExaMiner. So at the end of the day, both of them are being covered at the second layer by our corporation. And so it'll all fall under one big demo rubric at the trade show. Customer's going to show up at the booth, for instance, and they'll say, what are you guys doing here? And we start to explain to them. They say, well, okay, I'm a consultant. I'm a cloud consultant. I currently consult on, Nutanix, and I do, Office 365 stuff, and I specify other things. What cloud do you typically use? I'm mostly an Azure person, but sometimes I do Google. Sometimes I do AWS. Every now and then I can see throwing my some other way. But at the end of the day, they'll look at it and they'll say, geez, you guys are able to bring this thing in at a significant price deduct AWS. What is your performance and security? And that's where we get to tell them all that really shines about the network, what you guys really bring to the table in terms of providing security and performance and proximity and latency, low latencies and so forth. So we'll bring them over to a pod, and we'll log into the pod, and we'll start with a console. And in the console on the left-hand side, they will be able to see a whole bunch of ExaMiners. They'll also be able to see a whole bunch of relayers. And so you can imagine that an MSP type, a partner, somebody who has the ability to specify or sell cloud storage to some of their business compatriots, right? Might also be somebody who owns a number of ExaMiner instances, right? Maybe they have 22 DIYs scattered around, and they've got, the $99 license on all of them. And essentially what they do is they go out in their region where they have theirs spread around, and they sell storage to people that they know because they're in some business club or whatever. And they're able to go ahead and specify and recommend and do that. Well, if they do, what ends up happening is they get an override. They get an affiliate fee. We already have a process and a number worked up on that for storage partners. If they want to go farther and they want to run their own relayers and just let the customers upload to their relayers, they can do that and earn more. They actually become the customer, quote unquote. And, they're the ones that are ultimately responsible for the accounting and the payment and so forth. So there's a lot of ability for them to look at that sort of stuff. And you might be somebody in an IT position in a larger organization that has, 4 or 5, facilities scattered around a continent or even around the globe. And all of a sudden what happens is you realize, well, we've got 5 relayers in our organization and I've got to manage them all. So you have the ability in the console to go out and, touch up every single relayer that you have living in your organization. And then at the same time, you can click over here on the left-hand side and click on your Examiners and have them all pulled up over on the right-hand side with the application window. So that is what the product looks like. And that's hopefully what we're going to do a good job of showing here in the next couple of weeks at the show. And if you're coming, you definitely want to stop in for a demo and, check it out. It's really starting to come together. And I think by the time we're all said and done with it, it's going to be a really dynamite product. And I think we're going to have a time selling it to people. And I really feel so great about where we are. So it's really interesting to me because in your world, in a lot of cases, you're not sure if things are so great. You're sort of kind of wondering, geez, we got all these people here. There's no data on the network. When's it going to go mainnet? When's, what, and it's like, are we getting contract? All the questions. And there's some, not frustration, but just some tension out there right now. And I get it. And then, of course, on the other side of the fence, a lot of you are also people that are interested in the coin. So you've bought some of the coin and you can't look at the chart right now and not be a little bit depressed because it goes straight up and then it comes straight back down. And it doesn't look like it's going to stop going down. It looks like it's probably going to go right directly to zero, right? So you're all sort of wondering if that's the case. Did you get involved with, a rug pull? Did somebody take all the money and run away? And, who knows and blah, blah, blah. But look, that's just not the right place to be. Right now, things are actually looking as best as they've ever looked. And, we're going to go do this trade show and we aren't going to come out of this trade show with, millions of terabytes of storage that show up on the day after. That's not how that works. We're going to go out and we're going to introduce ourselves to the world. And we will get a lot of foot traffic from people that have an interest in the kind of stuff we're doing simply because of the booth proximity we got to a couple of other big players. Microsoft is right behind us. Amazon is right in front of us. And we're in the front of a hall, a new hall. So we're going to end up having some pretty good ability to catch the attention of some people that have the ability to throw down some money and to commit to using our network for different kinds of purposes. That process won't be overnight. It's not like they'll show up on the day after and just immediately, book $50,000 worth of storage. They're going to have to go back. They're going to have to try it out. They're going to have to convince their bosses. They're going to have to get over the idea that this is a crypto network underneath and it's got a bunch of miscreants that are actually serving up storage from their bedroom while they're eating their Captain Crunch and playing, World of Warcraft or whatever it is you guys do these days. Yeah, I probably just aged myself like enormously right there. Sorry. But the deal is that at the end of the day, people are going to look at it and realize we're more secure than Amazon. We're probably going to be more performant when it's all said and done. And our environmental footprint is night and day from cloud storage that's out there in the world. We are going to be able to stand up and say we are the greenest solution available. So there's so much good stuff that is about to happen for us that if you have any of that, feelings of anxiety and that this isn't the thing, I think you just need to kind of like just suck it up and just let it go, because it's not the case. And by the time we get to the end of this year, I think everybody's going to be in a pretty good, place. If you are one of those people that thinks that April 24th, you're going to have a whole bunch of storage on your network, you need to stop that right now, because that isn't the case. Product launch definitely is April 23rd. And on May 23rd, there might be a little more data on your stuff. And on May, June, July, August, it'll probably look like a little line going up and to the right. But it isn't going to be this thing where you get, 18 terabytes over the next 42 days. So if anybody's telling you April 23rd is launch and that'll change everything, probably not going to happen. So, just need to be aware of that. All right, that's it. I'll turn it over to questions here, and we'll see what we end up with. Let me see if anybody's got their hand up. Well, somebody did, but doesn't look like anymore. Let me look. No questions today? Works for me. We got so much work to do. It's just kind of a thing. Well, yeah, sure. Hang on a second. All right, come to the stage.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I hope everybody's well. I've just got a couple of questions I'd like to throw out to you, if that's okay.
That's what we're here for.
Okay, first off, 50% of what you've just said didn't quite get, but it's all good. I'm not looking at instant data, so that's all good. Here for you for the long run, so that's no problem. Then I want to buy a software license tomorrow for both my nodes, but I was just wanting to know, one, is it a perpetual license or is it yearly? Then also, you mentioned on your last seminar last week that you were short of Xeon processors, but if we've got a couple, I was wondering if there's any way of actually being able to become like a system builder, to be able to build a system to your specifications rather than what we think it should be.
Okay, so let's start with the licensing question. We're not really sure yet. And my guess is, well, let's put it this way. I'm not going to say I have a guess. What I'm going to say is this. When we first started out the idea of licensing, we said in the beginning there'd be a renewal. And, as we've had some time to think it through, maybe a renewal isn't going to be necessary. Or if a renewal is there, maybe the renewal is just a nominal figure. It's not like if the license is $99, maybe the renewal is like, $14.95 or something like that. I don't know yet, but it's probably accurate or correct to say that the license won't be as important in year 2 and year 3, because by year 2 and year 3, you will actually be real valuable to us, right? I mean, we'll be storing data on your network, we'll be paying you and so forth, and we will actually be out there earning revenues selling storage on the network. So we will be funding a lot of our development from the actual storage rentals and so forth that are out there. So there's a pretty good chance that it's a one-time license fee. But I don't want to commit to it one way or the other at this point, because I don't want to end up in the place 12 months from now where I have to walk it back. I'm going to leave it open-ended, and I'm going to tell you that in our mind, if there's any way we can do it, we will do it. So it's a one-time fee or it's a mitigated fee, and it's not the entire thing every year in and year out on the 99. Now, we did say if you bought the full license at $450 that the renewal would only be the 99, but even that, I think, is probably suspect at this point. As far as standing up the ability to build, rigs and so forth, we've said this over a few events, that, look, we're happy to be in the business of building and selling computers, and, it will be a part and parcel of what we do. It's a great way to ensure uniformity on the network. It's a great way to sort of understand specifically how to best assemble and to put together a network. And ultimately, it's a way to raise capital as well to fund development. So it's definitely going to be a thing we'll continue to do. But it's not going to be a thing we're going to monopolize. from our perspective, we're going to be quite happy to see 5 or 6 or 10, some number of manufacturers out there building our thing. And, the only thing that we're going to ask in the first year, at least, maybe all forever, I don't know, but is if you decide to get into that business of building and selling our systems, that we ask that you send us a system to validate. And in that validation process, we will give you logo permissioning so that you can put on powered by Examiner or whatever the logoing process that we put together, so that you are a legitimate authorized partner. And once we pull that together and put that partnering program together, you will end up getting other things. There are other things we can do for you. We can do, MDF money, which is, marketing funds that we can throw your way to, sell more systems into your part of the world. We can do co-op money. We can, partner with you. If you decide you want to take a small trade show, we can help you with that. There's a lot of things we're going to be able to do once we start getting, to the next phase of our corporation. What I mean by next phase is once we get past our first real capital raise. We've not had a real capital raise yet. Everything's just been some angel investors throw us a bit of scratch that we keep working off of. We get a little bit more scratch. We keep working off it. We've not had a real capital raise yet. When we go out there with a fully working product, a couple of quarters of revenue under our belt, several revenue streams in that process, I think we're going to have a pretty good run when we go to a venture capital, dog and pony and ask to get capitalized, especially since we're in that phase right now where they're literally funding anything that can breathe. So, for us to show up, I think is going to be a real interesting situation. Anyway, hopefully that got your 2 questions.
It did. Sorry, but one last thing. When I was referring to being a system builder, sorry, maybe I should rephrase that. I was just wondering, is it possible to get a list of items so that I can match it as for my own rig rather than using what I think is the correct way of doing it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily see that being a problem. We've never tried to obfuscate. The fact of the matter is that the actuality of the rigs themselves is they aren't that much. I mean, they're pretty basic things. This server we're talking about, by the way, I'm not even sure that it's built for storage providers, but it could be one that's pretty good. This server we're going to show off at the show is a 1U ASUS model. It's a reasonable model. It's not a super micro. It's but they're a Taiwan manufacturer, the good rep. But it's Xeon, not Celeron like the flagship is. We don't need Xeon in that unit, but look, if you're somebody building for a colo or something like that, having a robust Xeon in there could be a good benefit. Requires us to put a graphics card in there, requires us to put a little bit different configuration for memory and stuff. At the end of the day, I'm happy to share that. I don't think there's any reason why we wouldn't share it. But more important, I think that unit is possibly going to become a sold relayer configuration, right? Where, in other words, the customer comes to us and says, okay, well, we really like this concept. We set up a relayer, we're running it on-prem, we're managing it. It's okay, it works. But we're really concerned about this Postgres database. We're really concerned about cache growth. We're really concerned about, being able to, grow this if we need to. So can't we just buy a rig from you and just put it into a rack and have it just run? And that the answer to that question has to be a yes. And so this unit will probably be the first model of that, and showing the relayers running on the unit itself at the trade show will be a way of us showing that capability. So if you're somebody who wants to build relayers, right, for businesses that you're going to recommend to rent storage on our network, that's going to be a really cool business model, I think, because you as a consultant can go out to a customer and say, well, look, you got to put this relayer thing in, and we make it easy. I just bring a box out and I just plug it into your network. And then you make an override on the box. You also make an override on the storage that gets sold. And if you want to build the box yourself, you make a profit on the box too, right? So, it's just a beautiful model, I think, all the way around.
Yeah, for sure. It just trying to get my hands on one from you directly has just been really tough because of the shortage. But that's why I was trying to see if I could build one to your spec, just to put into my own rack.
Yeah, that's it's not touchy, but it's an ongoing subject. I mean, there's just a number of issues that have prevented me from pulling the trigger on the next order. Some internal, some unforced errors, and some outside that are a little bit more challenging that need to be addressed before I can pull the trigger. I could legitimately pull the trigger tomorrow on another order, but I just don't know. I just don't know if it's time yet. It's this kind of thing where every time we seemingly get to this place where it makes sense to start to evaluate that, something else happens. The thing that happened recently is that China went back into total COVID lockdown. And so I don't know what the next 6 months are about to look like. I sort of have this weird feeling that supply chains are about to break down for another 4 to 6 months, and it's going to get a little bit weird. But in any way, that's part and parcel of what we're dealing with on our end. On the good news side of that, the current first batch is coming to a conclusion. We're going to get all the units out there before the product launch. That's the commitment I made. So if we don't hit it, it's only going to be by a couple of units, but we're going to hit it. So that's the good news there. I probably will have an announcement at the show on when we're going to have the next ordering take off. That's what it looks like at this point.
Thank you.
Sure. All right. Looks like that's it. I'm getting ready to hit the end button if there's no more questions. Let's see if there's any more questions. Small show today. Not sure it got recorded. Probably didn't, so I wouldn't be worrying about it. This wasn't a very important. Well, actually, it was one of the ones. Probably. We'll talk about contracting a lot more in the next several of these. And of course, the event's going to be the event. So if you didn't get the information out of today's thing and we didn't record it, we probably did. But if we didn't, don't worry about it because this contracting thing is going to continue. The big take home right now is you don't need to worry about only having one contract or two contracts. You do need to recognize that we are working out the issues related to multiple drives. And there are issues, by the way, I mentioned this in the channel the other day, and I'm sure it was a little confusing to some folks that, this idea of 2 terabyte drives on Windows systems, it's not exactly something that we say with certainty, right? It just isn't. And it creates some problems, even though it solves some pretty significant potential problems. To be honest with you, the best strategy is one folder per drive. And, in the long run, that's ultimately what we're going to want to see. But I think what's going to end up happening in a lot of cases is the software licensing is going to drive a much higher push towards a Linux environment than we would have normally had. Anyway, looks like that is all the questions. So appreciate you tuning in today. We got to get back to work, working on this thing. The show is really pushing us to the limits right now. And if you're coming to Vegas, definitely stop by the booth, say hi. Obviously, our whole team won't be there. Several of our developers are in Moscow, so that's a problem. Some of our developers are in Europe. Some are in Tennessee. I don't know what their status is. If they're going to come, they haven't told me yet. But you'll see some of our familiar faces there. And definitely come up and say hi. And you might even get a chance to win that one you racked with. So hope to see you. Thanks.